So what do I think about life? The first thing I think about is whether thinking has something to do with life, and what form of life is thinking, or at least what kind of life form can think about a question like, what do I think about life? And the mystery for me is that life happened once and once only in the whole history of the earth. We live on a planet that is chock full of life, what Stephen Jay Gould called a full house of infinite organisms and different life forms that have populated the seas, the air, the earth, and yet it all has one common origin, and it happened once and once only. And no one has ever been able to reproduce that moment of Genesis. And no one has any credible theory for how it all began. What we do know is that the planet was not hospitable to life in its origins, far from it. And that the first sparks of life, which, let's say the first primitive cells with membranes containing RNA, occurred within common clay minerals, which provided the basic platform for the formation, growth, and division of the earliest living cells on Earth. So in the beginning, you can say there was clay. And it was the labor of living organisms fighting every inch of the way that turned this into a soil that was hospitable to life. So I would say that in the beginning was an earth that was aggressively hostile and resistant to life's colonizing ventures on Earth. And it took the tremendous self-affirming struggles of life itself to transform Earth, sky, and the oceans into elements that were conducive to life. So this is the paradox of life on Earth, is that it was life that first brought about the conditions on Earth that made life possible on the planet today. So we're talking about the relentless metabolism of primitive bacteria that over untold millions of years turned this atmosphere into one that was rich with oxygen and carbon dioxide, and allowed this atmosphere to form around the Earth and made possible the process of photosynthesis. And that process of photosynthesis in turn transformed the planet as a whole into a living organism. Our Earth is a living organism as a whole. So one could say that over time Earth was turned into a thriving garden, and that the first gardeners, the original gardener who worked on the soil and made it fit for growth, was primitive life, long before we humans, with our thinking minds, came into being. What distinguishes life from the inanimate matter from which it originates is this continuous self-exceeding by which life bursts forth out of the inanimate. And here I'm with Nietzsche, who said we should not think of life as something opposed to death. Life is a species of what is dead, and a very rare species at that. And it's this, as I said, this self-exceeding that bursts forth out of the inanimate and ecstatically maintains itself in being through expenditures which increase rather than deplete the reservoirs of vitality. So my definition of life is that it's an excess. In fact, I would say life is the self-ecstasy of matter. And in that regard, I am convinced that our thinking minds participate in this excessive surplus that allows life to always precariously be just beyond the condition of inanimate matter. And in that sense, it's a constant struggle, and one that keeps us in a perpetual state of anxiety and frustration. And that is a proper element of thought, and that's what I think about life. So for the second segment, I thought I'd speak about my book, Juvenscence, A Cultural History of Our Age, which is the last book I published a few years ago. And in this book, I asked a simple question of how old are we who belong to this age of juvenescence, as I call it. The age of juvenescence I understand to be largely the post-war period in Western societies, where we've undergone such tremendous forms of juvenilization, such that we are a significantly younger species than even our 19th century ancestors were. If I look at my father's yearbook and see the graduating class of undergraduates in his generation, I mean, they look like they could be the parents of our undergraduates at this point, no? So what interests me about this juvenescence is, first, the role that youth plays in our species. It's clear that our evolution as a human species is largely due to this genius that we have to retain youthful characteristics in later periods of development. Biology is called neoteny. It's not important that, the word is not important. But it is the fact that we spend much larger proportions of time being juvenile, as infants and juveniles, dependent on our parents for very prolonged period of time compared to other species. And it's because of this extravagant youthfulness, period of youthfulness that human beings have, that we are creatures of learning. Because to begin with, we're born as embryos. If we had to be born inside the womb, our brains would be too large to actually exit the vaginal canal, and therefore most of the latter half of our fetal growth takes place outside of the womb, because we have these huge brain, and that huge brain is also part of the infancy of the prolonged infancy of our thing. So learning becomes the primary strategy of survival of the human beings. And the fact that we are able to retain in later stages of development these youthful characteristics is what defines us as a very youthful species compared to other primates, for example. And so I think our human species has an innate, intrinsic inclination and favoring of youthfulness. And somehow in modern times, through the development of technology, through the development of public health and prosperity and so forth, this inner youthfulness, this intrinsic juvenilization of our species has exploded into forms of cultural expression that make us particularly singular, even in human history, because of the age that we have. And I am fascinated by certain figures. Socrates is one of them. Socrates is someone who was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, but we know that he used to prefer even a man of my age to hang out with the youth of Athens, and that there was a youthfulness in him that went up until the very end of his life, where he still looked forward even to the afterlife with a kind of youthful erotic intensity. He was also committed to philosophy. Philosophy is something that appeals to, the Romans thought philosophy was appropriate to a stage of life when you were young. Philosophy makes its most intense appeals to people in their adolescence and early adulthood. The philosopher who goes on to become the wise old man is actually very neotenic. He's holding on to a stage of life that philosophy is appropriate to. The Romans thought you grow out of it and you start doing serious things after you've studied philosophy. Socrates is a perfectly neotenic figure. He's holding on to his youthfulness. I'm fascinated also by the Gospels, Jesus, the Christian Revolution, the idea that only the child will inherit the kingdom of God, and the way in which what everyone was criticizing at the time as a childish religion was able to triumph over the oldest, wisest religions on earth. How can the child become triumphant over the adult and the wise man? You have that in those two cases I've mentioned. I discuss a number of other cases, but for me it's just evidence that there is a way in which our species has this innate inclination towards prolonging and extending the luxury of youth. And the more prosperous society becomes, the more it enables youth to, it gives room for that youth to extend itself almost indefinitely. And we are now living in a period where there are new concepts like emerging adulthood. What is emerging adulthood? It's the idea that between 20 and 30, many of us don't want to make our fundamental decisions. We're just exploring our options, and we're putting off the moment when we become adults. We're putting it off, and we'll put it off later and later and later, because if we're left to ourselves, we'll never grow up. There's an intrinsic reluctance to grow up in all human beings, but in the final analysis, it's necessary for our survival that we also learn how to become adults, because without the adult world, this luxury of our prolonged youth is impossible.